Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about comparative advantage and the open economy and trade and why we trade. First, a little background. World GDP today is nearly 9 times greater than it was at the end of World War II. 9 times. World trade has increased to more than 28 times what it was in 1950. And the United States has figured prominently in this expansion of global trade. See, here's kind of this little graph about trade volume and world GDP, and here's sort of this growth in U.S. exports and imports. And so we've learned a bit before about the concepts of specialization and mutual gains of trade, and we can understand gains from trade among nations by understanding output gains from specialization between individuals. The same concepts hold. Right, so let's consider this scenario. We've got this 8-hour day, and there is an ad specialist who can either make 2 pages of ad copy per hour or 1 art rendering per hour, and a computer artist who can make 1 page of ad copy per hour and 1 art rendering per hour. So here's what they do if they sort of don't trade and split their day 4 hours each. You can see that the total output on the right of copy is 12, and the total output of renderings is 8. But if they were to specialize, right, and if the ad specialist sticks to ad copy and the computer artist sticks to renderings, then we get kind of this net gain in total output. Right, see? So we want to kind of remember a bit about comparative advantage, which is the ability to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost compared with other producers. So this can hold among other nations. There's specialization among nations. To demonstrate the concept of comparative advantage, we consider a simple two-country, two-good world. So production and consumption capabilities in a two-country, two-good world, we're kind of thinking about the model. We show maximum feasible quantities of software and PCs, and we use all resources, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. We assume that all the feasible allocations of inputs are used. Right? And we'll say that U.S. residents can utilize all their resources to produce 90 units of software or 225 PCs per hour. Residents of India are able to utilize all their resources to produce either 100 units of software or 50 PCs per hour. Right? We're sort of saying that our two goods are software and PCs, and our two nations in this model are India and the U.S. Right, so here we have, look, a similar sort of table to what we had before with the ad copy and renderings example. Right, and let's see, we've got this comparative advantage, right? The opportunity cost of producing a tablet is lower in the United States than in India. Right? I guess we're switching to a different example. The cost of producing one tablet is 0.4 apps, and the cost of producing one app is 2.5 tablets. The opportunity cost of producing an app is lower in India, though, right? The cost of producing one app or tablet equals 2 apps, and the cost of producing one app equals 0.5 tablets. And now we'll sort of look at our example with out trade, right? That's what's called. You may have heard the word autarky before. Without trade is all it means. So we're going to kind of think about the world without trade over here, and we have the world output here. They're kind of splitting their time. So the United States and India will specialize in activities with which they experience a lower opportunity cost. In other words, each will specialize in the activity in which they have a comparative advantage. So specialization in production. The U.S. will produce 225 tablet devices and no apps, while India will produce 100 apps and no tablet devices. Consumption with specialization in trade. The United States is willing to buy 1 digital app as long as it provides in exchange no more than 2.5 devices. This is the U.S.'s opportunity cost of producing 1 digital app at home. They don't want to exceed the opportunity cost. And a similar story for India in this example. See, we've got a little graph here, or a table, I guess. So by specializing and engaging in trade, the United States can consume 75 digital apps imported from India and consumes 150 tablets produced at home, while India consumes 25 digital apps produced at home and imports 75 tablets from the United States. There is gains from trade here. The U.S. has gained from specialization and trade is 45 digital apps. India can consume 37.5 more tablet devices. These are net gains. See, we've got kind of a nice recap of our tables that we had before. So specialization is the key here. Specializing in producing goods for which a nation has a comparative advantage allows for greater efficiency. Production capabilities increase, making possible greater worldwide consumption through international trade. So, some things to note on specialization in trade. Not everyone gains from trade. We can't right, and what that means is there are net gains from trade, but there can be some winners and losers overall in trade, but on the net, there's always something to be gained. We cannot run out of exports, right? There's stuff we can always be exporting. Every country will always have a comparative advantage at something, right? There's always kind of a lower opportunity cost at something. Other benefits from international trade are the transmission of ideas, right? Not only are you trading with someone, but you're talking to them. You're sharing information. New goods and services will be spread. New processes are transmitted. You learn from each other. And then there's this idea of intellectual property must be introduced, right? Who owns what is transmitted, what ideas are transmitted? And something to note about trade is that in the long run, imports are perfectly paid for by exports, and any restriction on imports ultimately reduces exports. When a country engages in trade, it is not competing against other countries. It's trading for its own benefit, and all nations stand to benefit from trade. So here are some questions we may have heard before about the United States and trade. Is the United States falling behind in global trade, or do we need to really stay competitive internationally? And what does global competitiveness actually mean? Well, so the United States isn't falling behind. The United States leads in overall productive efficiency, according to the Institute for Management Development in Switzerland, right? So there are some reasons for this. Well, think about how the force of entrepreneurship is in the United States, and how strong investment is in information technology, and sort of how the United States can pioneer a lot of these services. And you can think of like Silicon Valley, for example. But so there are some typical reasons that you would hear against free trade, some typical arguments. And one is, of course, the infant industry argument. And it pretty much says that, look, we've got this kind of developing industry at home, and we want to impose tariffs on global companies in that industry so our own industry can kind of build itself up. So this argument contends that tariffs should be imposed to protect from import competition from an industry that's trying to get started. And so the idea, I guess, is after a while, you're going to lift these tariffs. What often happens is you kind of have this company or industry in a bubble. And once it's exposed to outside competitors, it doesn't tend to survive, right? There's also dumping that can happen. People are scared of predatory dumping, which is the selling of a good or service abroad below the price charged in the home market, or at a price below its cost of production. This is incredibly hard to prove. We're going to talk a little bit about GATT and the WTO, which are organizations that sort of oversee trade, and it's really difficult to prove dumping. There's also the argument to protect domestic jobs. Well, that brings up the question, do imports reduce domestic jobs? And there are a couple of studies that really find no causal link between rates of imports and unemployment. And you can kind of think also a counter, right? This abroad competition spurs innovation, which creates jobs. There can be, again, some losers domestically in trade. However, the jobs created by innovation in net should make up for it. There's different ways that you can see trade restricted. The quota system, which are basically restrictions on imports, so you can't import more than a certain amount. And here's kind of a graph. You see supply it kind of changes from this dark red line to this kind of orange line, and it just kind of hits this point and then shoots right up because you can't go any further. Right? And what we see is that quotas will push up the prices of imports, and we basically don't reach a natural equilibrium. There are different types of quotas. There's voluntary restraint agreements and voluntary import expansion. And a voluntary restraint agreement is like an official agreement with another country that will voluntarily restrict the amount they'll export to you. And voluntary import expansion is an official agreement with a country in which it agrees to import more from the United States, right? There are, of course, tariffs, which are taxes on imports, benefit import competing industries, right? And they harm the consumers because prices go up. Naturally, industries that are at home that have to compete with these imported goods, they like it because it makes abroad goods more expensive. And here is sort of this example that happens with a $50 tariff, right? Supply has to go up because to deal with sort of this additional cost in production. And here's sort of another graph of what happens to demand for domestic smartphones. The other one was abroad smartphones. All right, so kind of a brief history of tariffs in the United States. It's almost always on imported goods, and they've completely, they vary good to good. And the highest rate was sort of in the 1930s with Smoot-Hawley, is something you may have heard before. In 1962, the Trade Expansion Act kind of gave the president authority to reduce tariffs like up to 50%, which was kind of a huge turnaround in global trade. The Trade Reform Act did similar reductions, and the Trade Tariff Act resulted in completely low tariffs. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is GATT, which is what I brought up before. It was kind of like the first establishment to kind of bring the world in reducing trade barriers. And it was replaced, of course, with the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 1995. And so here's kind of this this movement of tariffs in the United States. So the WTO, this is kind of this global body that handles, trade disputes, and it's got the largest membership, and it fosters kind of the most important global agreements on trade. There are, in addition, sort of regional agreements, so you can have regional trade blocs. You can think of like the European Union or NAFTA. And it's just a group of nations that grants members special privileges. There's also sort of trade diversion, which can happen with this. It's the shifting of trade from countries outside the regional trade bloc to countries within the bloc. So you may be trading with countries outside of NAFTA. NAFTA comes up and you trade way more with countries within NAFTA. There's this concept of trade deflection, which is moving partially assembled products into a member nation of a bloc, completing assembly, and then exporting them to other nations within the blocs so that it benefits from preferences granted by the bloc. Right? There's also sort of rules of origin, which is a regulation that nations have to kind of establish where the origin of a product was. And so here's kind of finally this nice graph about how regional trade blocs have evolved through time.